the complexity of what's happening on the ground in Iran in early 2026. We're looking at a convergence of crises.
A convergence, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, our sources range from the official findings of the UN Human Rights Council's fact-finding mission, that's report AHRC 5863 for anyone who wants to look it up, all the way to these granular, real-time analyses of Iran's financial markets.
And all that is set against contemporary news reports covering these rapidly evolving protests and the lethal crackdowns that follow. Okay, let's just dive right in then. Our mission today feels crystal clear because the crises themselves are so sharp, they're parallel, and they're intensifying. We're going to dissect Iran's current state through two distinct but fully connected lenses. So on one side, you've got the economic catastrophe. I mean, the catastrophic currency collapse that is fueling these massive broad-based protests all across the country. And then on the other side, we have the systematic, the deep, and just the horrifying scale of the ongoing political repression and human rights violations that have been, according to the UN, formalized and expanded since the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Movement.
And I think the essential point that the sources make, really the core of it, is that these two realities are no longer separate things. They're fully intertwined.
Right, one feeds the other.
Completely. You have this economic despair, this runaway inflation that has made daily survival just impossible for huge parts of the population. And that, in turn, acts as the trigger for the mass unrest and defiance.
And the state's response to that economic desperation is, of course,
it's the deployment of the exact same deeply entrenched system of political and gender-based persecution that the UN mission has so meticulously documented.
So the sources really define the immediate stakes for us. We're looking at Iran grappling with what is arguably its deepest economic crisis in modern history.
No question.
And this level of financial pain, it's triggered what the reports describe as the largest and most economically broad-based challenge to the Islamic Republic's authority since that 2022 movement.
And all of this is happening while the state, according to these international bodies, is actively formalizing and expanding persecution, especially against women, girls, and ethnic minorities.
The stakes just couldn't be higher.
No, because this isn't just cyclical unrest. This is a systemic vulnerability being completely exposed by financial collapse, and it's being met with a systematic campaign of human rights abuse that's designed to reassert total control.
Okay, so let's start right where the unrest began. The immediate signal of failure, the currency. The real shocking plunge is really the economic event that lit the fuse for these new massive protests in late 2025 and into early 2026.
What really stands out in the economic source material isn't just the decline, it's the sheer velocity of the collapse. We're talking about a currency that has, for all intents and purposes, lost all confidence.
What are the numbers we're looking at?
The specific data points to the real dropping to roughly 1.4 million per US dollar in late December 2025. And by the first few weeks of January 2026, those open market snapshots, the street rate that ordinary people and businesses actually have to use, it was clustered even higher, around 1,457,000 reals for a single US dollar.
1.45 million for $1. I mean, when you hear numbers like that, the immediate thought is that the currency is going to zero. I should probably clarify that, because while literal zero is impossible as long as the state functions,
right,
the practical effect for the average Iranian is pretty much the same thing.
That's a crucial distinction. A currency can't literally trade at zero. That would mean the whole country's financial system has just ceased to exist. But when people say the rizzle is going to zero, they're describing two very painful, very tangible realities.
Okay, what are they?
First, purchasing power. It has fallen to virtually nothing for ordinary citizens. Inflation means prices are just constantly outpacing wages, making basic survival a continuous emergency.
And the second reality?
The second is just describing the rate of the collapse itself. The fact that the exchange rate requires adding more and more zeros to the number of reals you need, moving from 1.5 million to 2 million and so on. It just signals this accelerating loss of faith.
And the government is, I understand, trying a kind of cosmetic fix for that second problem, the unwieldy number of zeros on the banknotes.
Yes. The sources confirm that Iran's parliament approved a plan back in October 2025 to redenominate the currency by removing 4 zeros. The central bank was given 2 years to prepare for a 3-year transition.
But that's just an accounting cleanup, right?
It's purely an accounting cleanup. It just makes the numbers look less chaotic. So if the open market rate is, say, 1,457,000 reals per dollar, removing 4 zeros just makes it 145.7 new units per dollar.
But the underlying inflation, the real engine of all this pain, That remains completely untouched.
Precisely. If inflation continues to roar, and we can talk about those numbers in a minute, the new currency will just start losing value all over again. They'll have to start adding zeros back eventually. Redenomination doesn't solve the real problems.
And speaking of real problems, this lack of confidence. It seems the structure of the currency market itself is actively dysfunctional. It's not just one market, it's this complicated multi-tier distortion that the sources suggest is a primary engine for corruption, for what economists call rent-seeking.
Absolutely. The system is just, it feels like it's designed to benefit insiders and drain resources from the productive economy. You have three main, wildly different tiers. First, you've got the official administered rate. It's anchored at a completely unrealistic 42,000 reals per dollar. This is used for very, very limited, high-level official transactions.
So almost irrelevant for daily life.
Almost. Then second, there's the preferential import support rate. This one is sitting around 285,000 reals per dollar. Now, this rate was intended to subsidize imports of essential goods like medicine and some basic foods.
Wow.
But it has become notoriously known as a corruption pipeline for regime insiders who get access to these subsidized dollars.
And then there's the third tier, the rate that governs everyday life for everyone else.
That's the open market or street rate. And that's that brutal rate we mentioned earlier, around 1.4 million reals per dollar in January 2026. The gap between the official anchor of 42,000 and the market reference of 1.4 million is just staggering.
Wait, that represents a 35 times distortion?
A 35x distortion, yes.
A 3,500% gap between the official price of a dollar and the real price. That sounds like a system that is just designed for massive guaranteed insider profit. How does that rent-seeking actually work?
It's surprisingly straightforward, and the sources really highlight this as a core economic injustice. So imagine you are a well-connected intermediary, right?
Oh.
You are granted access to a huge allocation of dollars at that preferential rate, say 285,000 reals per dollar. You then use those cheap dollars to import something, maybe a non-essential good or maybe a supposedly essential good.
And instead of selling it at a price reflecting your cheap cost?
You sell it on the open market at a price that reflects the street rate of 1.4 million reals per dollar.
So you're making a profit on the subsidized dollar itself before you even sell the actual product.
Exactly. You get the hard currency at 285,000 and you can immediately sell it back into the market or use it to purchase assets at a value that's defined by the 1.4 million rate. This just accelerates the reals depreciation because it means that scarce hard currency is constantly being drained away from productive, legitimate use and into the pockets of intermediaries.
So this inherent instability is the context, but why did it get this bad, this fast in late 2025? What were the deep structural drivers?
The fundamental problems are really threefold. You've got U.S. sanctions, you've got policy missteps, and you have the resulting inflation. And inflation remains at crisis levels. It was 48.6% in October 2025 and only settled slightly lower, but still catastrophically high at 42.5% in December.
When you're approaching 50% inflation, that's hyperinflationary territory.
It is, in the sense that everyone is just seeking to offload their cash and buy anything that holds value dollars, gold, foreign property. It makes the currency weakness self-feeding.
And the underlying economic weakness provides no buffer against these pressures.
None at all. Weak growth just makes the fiscal pressure on the government worse. The World Bank was anticipating a GDP contraction of 1.7% in 2025 and projected a further shrinkage of 2.8% in 2026.
Which means lower tax revenue.
Right, which forces the government to finance its spending, often through printing money, which directly fuels even more inflation.
And of course, we can't ignore the impact of the U.S. sanctions that were reimposed post-2018.
Those sanctions just crippled Iran's ability to sell oil freely and restricted its access to the hard currency it needs to service its economy. The result is that the open market exchange rate is effectively a daily referendum on public and international confidence in the state's ability to manage its own finances.
But there was an immediate specific policy trigger in December 2025 that just blew this whole precarious situation up. One that links the technical economic debate directly to the protests on the street.
This is the moment. This is where the internal economic corruption fights translated directly into street action. In December 2025, the government made a crucial policy change. They decided to require importers to acquire their foreign exchange at the open market rate, that brutal 1.4 million reals per dollar rate, instead of the preferential subsidized rate of 285,000.
Let's just think about the mechanics of that. Importers who are buying necessary goods for the country suddenly have their input costs increase 5 times overnight.
Precisely. If you're an importer of, say, flour or medicine, you now need 5 times more reals to purchase the same amount of dollars. This move, while maybe theoretically aimed at eliminating that corruption pipeline,
Right.
it immediately collapsed confidence. It dramatically increased demand for dollars on the street. It froze normal commerce because businesses couldn't calculate their future costs. And it threatened to spike food and medicine prices overnight. This very technical policy debate was immediately and brutally felt by the working poor and the middle class.
And that brings us to the human cost. I mean, the sources paint a deeply, deeply harrowing picture of life under this collapse. This isn't just a political struggle anymore, it's a survival struggle.
It is a material crisis. Economists estimate that inflation has hollowed out purchasing power to a third or even less of what it was just a decade ago. Wages simply cannot keep up with a 40+% inflation rate.
And we see evidence of that with the systemic energy and water issues, right?
Oh, absolutely. The energy crisis is a profound sign of state mismanagement and neglect. Since February 2025, the country has been plagued by rolling blackouts lasting 3 to 4 hours daily right across the nation.
And that's due to aging infrastructure.
It's aging, neglected infrastructure, and the siphoning of resources and capital by the IRGC and its associated entities. I mean, you have parts of Tehran that are being subjected to water rationing for hours at a time. The basic stability of life is just collapsing.
And the anecdotal evidence of food insecurity is terrifying.
The sources mention this really disturbing anecdote of a man tearing chicken wings off in a supermarket and just fleeing. And this isn't a story of casual theft. It illustrates the raw desperation of people who literally cannot afford basic protein for their families. Spreading food insecurity has now reached households that were once stable, middle class.
This financial struggle also intersects directly with the regime's perceived geopolitical priorities. The sources highlight this public fury over foreign military spending.
Public criticism just intensified when it was revealed that Iran had transferred over $1 billion to proxies like Hezbollah in just 10 months of 2025.
$1 billion.
The billion. And this foreign expenditure, which is aimed at projecting power, it looks utterly indefensible to a population that's facing hunger and blackouts. There was a chant that summarized it perfectly. Warmongering is enough. Our tables are empty.
And we also have to remember the strategic weakness created by that 2025 12-day war with Israel.
That war significantly damaged Iran's missile and nuclear infrastructure. And the Minister of Finance, trying to deflect blame, publicly attributed the currency plunge specifically to the impact of that war.
So whether that's true or not, it feeds the narrative.
It feeds the narrative that the state is poorer, weaker abroad, and is sacrificing domestic stability for regional ambition. It severely reduces their margin for error at home.
So this shared precarity, this becomes the boiling point for the 2025-2026 protests. The spark was economic, but where did this revolt actually begin and how broad was it?
It began with the merchant class, the walkouts in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. This was triggered directly by that currency plunge and the fight over a preferential exchange rate subsidy.
The bazaar holds immense symbolic and historical weight in Iran, doesn't it?
It's a huge signal. The merchants of the bazaar were pivotal in the 1979 revolution. Their coordinated economic non-cooperation really accelerated the fall of the Shah. So when the bazaar moves against the regime understands that historical parallel, and the threat is immediate.
And these walkouts spread.
They cascaded, spreading nationwide across all 31 provinces, drawing in truck drivers, students, lower-income Iranians, and the decimated middle class. It made it the most geographically and economically broad-based challenge since 2022.
And the state response was a familiar, terrifying combination.
Okay.
Overwhelming force amid a near-total information blackout starting around January 8th, 2026.
The crackdown was immediate, and the sources described the internet and phone shutdown as the worst internet shutdown in Iran's history. A tactical decision clearly designed to shield the lethal repression from global scrutiny and prevent organizers from coordinating.
What are the casualty estimates?
They're stark and highly concerning. Iran Human Rights confirmed at least 192 deaths, but there are unverified reports, corroborated by accounts from medical personnel and eyewitnesses, that suggest the actual death toll may have surpassed 2,000.
2,000. That suggests a potential mass killing, and the sources include some really disturbing evidence from forensic centers.
Yes, and this is a moment we really have to pause and consider the gravity. Footage was sent to Iran International from the Karzak Forensic Center south of Tehran, and it showed rows and rows of bodies in body bags. One clip was labeled on screen referring to photo number out of 250, which strongly suggests the massive scale of fatalities concentrated in just that one facility.
And eyewitnesses confirm that.
Eyewitnesses visiting Karizak later reported seeing upwards of 400 bodies. This points to an unfolding mass killing that wasn't just confined to street clashes, but perhaps involved the rapid, lethal suppression of detainees.
Facing that kind of widespread violence and international pressure, the regime's elite response was, well, it was divided publicly, showing a split between maintaining a veneer of control and promising brute force.
A very clear dual message. You had the foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, projecting calm, claiming the situation was under total control, and trying to maintain international legitimacy by saying Iran was open to diplomacy. He blamed the violence entirely on foreign actors.
But the domestic message was purely one of terror.
Indeed. The judiciary chief, Golham Hassan Mohseni Ejei, immediately vowed no leniency for rioters. He urged judges to dispense swift, firm action. And critically, Tehran's public prosecutor threatened protesters with muharaba enmity against God, which is a capital offense. It carries a death penalty.
So they're using the harshest possible legal tools right from the start.
Immediately to instill fear.
And meanwhile, the international response was escalating, and the actions taken by the U.S. President, Donald Trump, changed the global calculus instantly.
The White House raised the stakes dramatically. They warned publicly that if Tehran continued the mass killing of peaceful protesters, the U.S. would strike Iran very hard.
Yeah.
But the most immediate and critical economic lever was the imposition of a massive 25% tariff on any country trading with Iran.
That tariff threat impacts China and India, Iran's major trading partners, so it makes the economic crisis immediately global, forcing other nations to choose sides.
It creates enormous foreign pressure. Countries like China, Iran's biggest trading partner, immediately threatened retaliation, but the economic math for them is brutal. Is their small, high-risk trade with Iran worth the imposition of a 25% tariff on their massive trade flows with the U.S.?
Right. It weaponizes global commerce to isolate Iran.
It does. And Trump also used powerful rhetorical support, telling Iranian patriots to keep protesting, take over your institutions. Help is on its way. This rhetoric, even without immediate military follow-through, it fuels Tehran's profound fears of external intervention or internal overthrow.
And the regime's immediate tactical response, beyond the arrests and the killing, was the appointment of the hardliner Ahmad Vahidi to a senior IRGC role,
which signals an institutional readiness to escalate violence. And sources confirm the IRG declared a yellow emergency, tightening internal control. However, it's vital we look at the internal elite structure. While anger on the street is at a maximum, the elite is not fracturing. Not yet.
And why is that?
The wealthy bazaris and the regime-linked oligarchs, they're insulated by their access to those subsidized dollars we talked about. They remain on the sidelines. They are too deeply embedded in patronage networks and have too much to lose from chaos to defect to the opposition. This institutional cohesion is what really separates 2026 from 1979.
Okay, let's shift to that second. Equally important crisis documented by the UN. This isn't just protest management. It is a system of state-sanctioned persecution, detailed in that UN fact-finding missions report. Let's start with the foundation of their findings. What is the core legal conclusion?
The core finding is stark. The Iranian authorities committed gross human rights violations that amount to crimes against humanity. And this legal terminology is profoundly important.
What specific crimes does it name?
It names murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, persecution, enforced disappearance, and other inhumane acts. And crucially, it says these were committed as part of a widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population.
Why is that specific phrasing, widespread and systematic attack against a civilian population, so legally significant?
It moves the actions far beyond mere human rights violations or just isolated acts of police brutality. It confirms the deliberate, the organizational, and the high-level nature of the violence. It means the repression is not accidental, it is policy.
So for the actions to be considered crimes against humanity,
the attack must be extensive and continuous, directed by state or organizational policy, and the victims must be civilians. This finding is the legal groundwork that's necessary for holding individuals up to the very highest levels accountable in international courts in the future.
And the most pervasive element of this systematic attack remains the persecution of women and girls who are defying the mandatory hijab, even 2.5 years after the 2022 protests began.
The persecution has deepened and it's evolved. Initially, the state responded with just pure force. Now, the rhetoric has shifted to a kind of pseudo-intellectual justification, claiming women's refusal to wear the mandatory hijab is due to their purported lack of awareness or education.
An attempt to pathologize defiance.
Exactly, rather than admit it's a political act of resistance.
But the enforcement mechanisms are anything but educational. They're formalized, aggressive, and widespread.
They are systematic mechanisms of state control. The Farajaya, which is the national police force, launched something called the Noor Plan, which means light or illumination, on April 13, 2024. This involved deploying officers all over the country explicitly to confront women and girls promoting social anomalies.
And the result of that?
The result was at least 618 women arrested in 2024. Furthermore, the IRGC commander for Tehran announced the deployment of ambassadors of kindness, a chilling euphemism for civilian monitors, tasked with ensuring compliance in public spaces like markets and public transport.
So the judicial system is actively reinforcing and cementing this discrimination. It's not just street arrests. The courts are validating the persecution.
That's right. The mission found that women are routinely summoned to criminal or revolutionary courts and sentenced based solely on reports provided by security forces or even just pictures submitted by the police. This confirms the whole state apparatus, backed by surveillance, is continuously monitoring and reporting non-compliance.
And the sentences include fines, travel restrictions.
And, very troublingly, the explicit use of corporal punishment.
Right, and the mission determined that flogging constitutes state-sanctioned torture. We have specific recent examples of this corporal punishment being carried out.
The examples are just horrifying. Roshnak Alisha was lashed 14 times in November 2024 for disturbing public chastity after she posted a video without the hijab. And this wasn't just for defiance, but for confronting a man who had assaulted her, which shows the judicial system prioritizes enforcing the dress code over protecting women from assault.
And there was the case of the singer.
Yes, the prominent Iranian singer Mehdi Yarahi. He was lashed 74 times in March 2025 for a song criticizing the mandatory hijab. The mission is crystal clear. Flogging is torture. It violates fundamental human rights.
We should probably also mention the catastrophic proposed hijab and chastity law. Even though it was suspended, it illustrates the extreme intent of the state.
The draft law was suspended for review, but its proposed penalties showed the legal apparatus's willingness to go to extremes. Up to 10 years in prison, a $12,000 fine, or potentially even the death penalty under the charge of corruption on earth for repeat offenders.
And while it's suspended, the state has still proceeded with implementing its spirit.
Yes, including closing private businesses for noncompliance. And most disturbingly, they announced the opening of a clinic specifically targeting teenage girls to undergo scientific and psychological treatment for hijab removal. This attempt to force psychological compliance on minors is just deeply coercive.
And the enforcement of these mandates relies heavily on surveillance. That sounds like something pulled straight from a high-tech authoritarian novel. Let's talk about that technological reach, especially the use of aerial drones and facial recognition.
The sources detail a chilling level of technological control. In April 2024, the state began using aerial drone surveillance to monitor hijab compliance in public spaces. On top of that, new facial recognition software was installed at university entrances, like at Amikabir University, to automatically monitor female students.
But the most insidious tool targeting the public is that mobile application, Nazer.
Right.
Tell us more about Nazer. It basically turns the general public into state informants, doesn't it?
It acts as an automated, technologically enabled citizen vigilante tool. The Nazer app allows vetted individuals and police to anonymously report instances of non-compliance, specifically women and girls not wearing the hijab in private vehicles.
So you just need the license plate.
The report requires capturing the license plate, the date, time, and location. This data is then fed into a centralized system that flags the vehicle online. The owner then gets a real-time warning text message. If the warnings are ignored, it triggers the vehicle being impounded.
That turns a private car into a semi-public zone of enforcement, and it expanded.
Yes. The 2024 update expanded the scope. It now targets compliance within ambulances, public transport, and taxis, broadening the net of surveillance beyond private cars to all public movement. And confiscating vehicles for violations remains a pervasive means of economic punishment.
Beyond women and girls, the mission found that violence was disproportionately directed at other specific vulnerable groups, starting with children.
Children were not peripheral figures in this. They were at the forefront of the protests, and the state's response was just brutally violent. The mission found evidence that between 57 and 68 children were killed. mostly boys, some as young as 7.
And how were they killed?
They were often shot with live ammunition or pellets at close range, or killed by severe beatings and blunt force trauma to the head. This suggests intentional, lethal force.
And the Iranian legal framework itself makes minors more vulnerable.
It does. Iran's penal code links criminal responsibility to the age of maturity, which is 9 years for girls and 15 for boys. This low threshold is a clear violation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it severely exposes girls to discrimination based on both gender and age, subjecting them to punishments typically reserved for adults.
And in detention?
In detention, children suffered mock executions, severe beatings, and were unlawfully held alongside adults in unofficial, secret facilities often operated by the IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence.
The mission also dedicated specific attention to crimes against ethnic and religious minorities, indicating that this violence was targeted and systematic, not incidental.
This is a critical point. The mission found that Kurdish and Baluchi minorities were victims of crimes against humanity and were affected as separate, distinct, persecuted groups. Evidence showed that security forces used military-grade weapons, AK-47s, Winchester rifles, and even DSHK heavy machine guns more frequently and immediately in these peripheral regions compared to central areas like Tehran.
The use of heavy machine guns against unarmed protesters.
It's a profound indicator of lethal intent.
And the reports on the torture methods described against these groups are uniquely egregious.
Detainees from these minority groups faced torture designed explicitly to humiliate and break them. This included waterboarding, being suspended from the ceiling by their arms for extended periods, severe sexual violence, and prolonged solitary confinement. The psychological abuse was compounded by security forces mocking their ethnicity and using dehumanizing language, referring to them as mountain goats and animals.
Which points to a deep-rooted structural discrimination.
Exactly. And on top of that, these individuals were charged at a much higher rate with national security offenses by the revolutionary courts.
Finally, the mission specifically investigated the treatment of LGBTQ+ persons, finding that they were targeted based on their perceived or actual identity.
They were actively targeted in acts amounting to gender persecution based on real or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, often intersecting with their activism. In detention, they faced repeated dehumanizing insults and were threatened with being outed to their families, which can be a lethal threat in Iranian society, all to extract forced confessions.
So the state's actions here were identified as an intentional campaign.
An intentional campaign of systematic violence and discrimination, leveraging cultural taboos to reinforce political control.
So the scale of the violence is met with the scale of the punishment. Let's move to the most definitive tool of state fear: the alarming, skyrocketing use of the death penalty as a political tool.
The statistics are horrifying, and they signal a very clear shift in state strategy. Credible human rights organizations recorded between 938 and 973 executions in 2024 alone.
973.
And what's crucial context here is that this represents a threefold increase from the 2021 execution figures the year before the Woman Life Freedom protests began.
So the trend strongly indicates the death penalty has been ramped up specifically to instill fear and repress dissent.
It's moving beyond typical criminal justice into political engineering.
And we've seen specific executions tied directly to the 2022 protests, designed to send a clear message.
At least 10 men have been executed in connection to the protests. The secret execution of Reza Rezai, a young Kurdish protester, on August 6, 2024, is a chilling example. He was executed without any prior notice to his family or his lawyer, following a trial that was widely condemned for lacking fair trial standards and relying heavily on a confession extracted under severe torture.
And that secrecy around the execution.
It's designed to maximize public shock and terror while minimizing the time for any international reaction.
The mission also tracked individuals who remain at imminent risk right now.
At least 11 men and 3 women remain at imminent risk of execution. There have been rare temporary reversals, like the death sentences against the rapper Tumarza Salehi and the activist Mahmoud Morabi being overturned by the Supreme Court. A rare glimmer that the system can sometimes correct itself under immense pressure.
But those are the exceptions.
Very much so. The subsequent reimposition of Mojahid Khoury death sentence in December 2024 after a retrial, despite it being overturned earlier, just reinforces the arbitrary and politically driven nature of these decisions.
This is where it gets particularly revealing about the regime's priorities. the escalating use of the death penalty specifically against women activists.
This trend is so indicative of the growing retaliatory tactics against women for their unabated defiance. The state is clearly targeting the symbolic leaders of the movement. Between July and October 2024 alone, 3 women activists, Sharifa Mohammadi, Pakshan Azizi, and Varisha Muradi, were sentenced to death.
What were the specific charges levied against them?
They were charged with Baghi, which is armed rebellion against the state. It was linked to their activism and perceived membership in opposition parties that the state labels as terrorist organizations. Pakshan Azizi's death sentence was upheld by the Supreme Court in January 2025, and Sharifa Mohammadi's was upheld in February 2025, placing both women at immediate dire risk.
These sentences, based on reported fair trial violations and torture, they underscore how the state is explicitly using the death penalty to intimidate and silence not just the activists themselves,
but the broader population. It sends an unmistakable message that the government is willing to destroy any individual, regardless of gender, who dares to challenge its foundational ideology and authority. This use of capital punishment is both a legal tool and a core political instrument of social control.
The flip side of this widespread violence and punishment is the near-total obstruction of accountability. The system is systematically designed to silence victims and protect perpetrators.
The mission detailed the systematic intimidation used to silence victims and their families. Gina Mahsa Amini's family, whose tragic loss sparked this entire movement, has been relentlessly persecuted. Her family was prevented from commemorating her death for the second time in September 2024. Then, in January 2025, her father was charged with propaganda against the state just for protesting the death sentence of another activist.
That is the regime punishing the grieving for publicly seeking justice.
It's institutionalized cruelty. Families who publicly advocated for accountability were systematically arrested, beaten, and charged with broad offenses like propaganda against the state or inciting riots. This is designed to silence and discredit them, transforming the victims into criminals. On top of that, some were denied employment or dismissed from their jobs, ensuring they remain economically and psychologically vulnerable.
And for the few who try to navigate the judicial system, the failure to investigate is pervasive.
The few attempts to pursue legal action against perpetrators were just met with systematic delay and dismissal. Judges routinely dismissed complaints against plainclothes agents, citing difficulties in identifying the perpetrators, and intentional difficulty created by the state's use of anonymous forces.
And they were pressured to take money instead.
Critically, yes. Judges pressured victims to accept daya, or blood money, payments instead of pursuing justice. It effectively monetizes impunity.
There was one rare exception to this impunity. The investigations following the Bloody Friday protest in Zahedan in September 2022, where 103 casualties were recorded in a single day. Why was that case different?
The scale of the massacre in Zahedan was so immense, 103 casualties in one day, that the state was forced to offer a limited concession to prevent further Baluchi unrest. The state actually acknowledged that security force shooting resulted in the loss of life of worshippers and bystanders who were not taking part in the unrest. In June 2023, the military prosecutor confirmed that 15 low-ranking law enforcement personnel had been convicted and sentenced.
But the mission found this process was ultimately inadequate.
Yes, due to a profound lack of transparency. The state failed to make public the specific charges, the names of the perpetrators, or the underlying evidence. In January 2025, the facade cracked further when a judiciary head announced the original charge of murder was dropped due to alleged difficulties in identifying perpetrators.
So what were they sentenced for instead?
They were sentenced to limited imprisonment up to 10 years and blood money payments. This lack of transparency ensures that high-ranking commanders and architects of the violence are never targeted, raising serious concerns about whether these investigations were truly meaningful or just a limited, localized concession.
Despite this systematic deep repression, the movement persists. Let's shift our focus to the woman, life, freedom core, the rhetoric and the tactics that have given this movement its incredible resilience and captured global attention.
The movement's identity is really centered on those 3 words. Woman, life, freedom. This slogan emerged as the rallying cry following Mahsa Amini's death, and it represents a profound societal response. It encapsulates a deep yearning for liberation and the reclaiming of a normal life, especially among young women. It highlights the massive cultural, political, and moral chasm between the people and the ruling Islamists.
The sources characterize this as employing pragmatist feminist tactics. That's a term we should probably define clearly for you, the listener.
That phrase means the movement is focused on achievable, immediate, and symbolic goals, because direct traditional political action like lobbying or elections is impossible. Since men still overwhelmingly control economic and political resources, activists are forced to adopt civil disobedience and symbolic actions to achieve gradual change. They're operating pragmatically, using experience and symbolic power to chip away at the system.
Okay, let's analyze the three most memorable symbolic actions that became global rallying cries. First, the act of cutting hair. What is the deep cultural resonance there?
Hair cutting carries deep cultural significance, rooted in ancient mourning traditions in Iran. It traditionally symbolizes profound sadness, grief, and often rebellion against oppression. By reviving this practice after Mahsa's death, protesters conveyed that she died tragically for a minor transgression, a lock of hair not properly hidden behind a scarf.
So it transforms the act of resistance into a public ritual.
A public ritual of mourning and defiance against sexual subjugation.
And the global impact of this simple, profound act was massive.
It went viral under the Hair for Freedom theme. It connected immediately with global audiences, echoing previous feminist campaigns. You had French actresses like Juliette Binoche and European Parliament representatives, including Sweden's Abir Al-Salani, publicly cutting their hair in solidarity. It shows the incredible persuasive power of a simple, symbolic act that transcends language.
Next, the burning of scarves, a direct, symbolic challenge to the compulsory dress code imposed by the Shia clerics.
The mandatory hijab, imposed after the 1979 revolution, it symbolizes the state's broader gender discrimination and its total control over women's bodies and choices. Burning the scarf is a potent symbolic action against this compulsory dress code, signifying liberation from the theological state. It started in Sari City and just spread like wildfire across Iran, and its influence was global. Syrian Kurdish women were repeating the protest method in solidarity.
The third tactic is perhaps the most confrontational, aimed directly at humiliating the authority figures who impose these codes: turban knocking.
Turban knocking is exceptionally bold. The turban and robe aren't just clothing. They are the uniforms that symbolize the authority, the ideological commitment, and the religious legitimacy of the Shia cleric class. Protesters aim to physically and symbolically reverse the expression of power.
The message being?
The message is clear. If clerics interfere in the clothing choices of women, the people will interfere in the clothing choices of the clerics, mocking the entire apparatus of religious authority.
And the effectiveness of this tactic was proven by the reaction it prompted from a major regional religious figure.
Indeed. The Iraqi cleric Muqtada al-Sadr, who is a highly influential Shiite figure in the region, publicly criticized the action and expressed profound concern about it spreading to other Islamic countries. That criticism alone shows the tactical success of the protest in challenging clerical authority beyond Iran's national borders.
Finally, we have to discuss the power of music as persuasive rhetoric that unified the movement. The song anthem.
Music is such a critical, accessible cultural resource for building shared emotional resonance and conveying a political message quickly. Shervin Hajipour's song Barai became the central protest rhetoric. Its reach was astronomical. It got over 40 million views on Instagram in less than 48 hours before it was censored.
And it won a Grammy.
It was so culturally and politically significant that it went on to win the Best Song for Social Change Grammy Award.
What made Barai such a profound piece of rhetoric?
It functioned as a piece of communal storytelling that answered the fundamental question of why the movement formed. The lyrics compiled tweets and everyday grievances for the tranquilizers and insomnia, for the longing for a normal life, and culminating in for woman, life, freedom. It wasn't abstract political theory. It was a list of everyday problems.
And it criticized Iran's condition.
Most critically, the lyrics criticized Iran's condition as a forced heaven. That two-word phrase is incredibly powerful. It highlights the profound gap between the state's ideological claim to be building an Islamic utopia and the miserable economic and social reality that ordinary citizens are living.
So we've established the depth of the economic crisis and the systematic nature of the repression. The question now is one of trajectory. Where does this intense tension lead? Why is Iran, despite this widespread unrest and economic despair, not repeating 1979?
This is the critical distinction that analysts constantly emphasize. The analogy to the 1979 revolution is misleading because the nature of the current regime's institutional strength is so vastly different. The success of 1979 depended not just on mass mobilization, but on the Shah's crippling indecision, his failing health, and most decisively the fragmented nature of his repressive apparatus, which eventually fractured and defected.
And that fragmented apparatus lacked the ideological loyalty we see today.
Today's regime, under Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has spent decades transforming the Islamic Republic into what experts call a theocratic security state. The core coercive institutions, the IRGC, the Basij, and the intelligence services, are highly institutionalized, cohesive, and fiercely ideologically committed. Their loyalty is not transactional in the short term. Their social mobility, their immense economic security, their entire identity is tied directly to the regime's survival.
So even massive protests and economic collapse won't necessarily trigger regime change because that vital element, elite defection, is highly unlikely right now.
Exactly. Revolutions require mass unrest intersecting with elite paralysis, or crucially, elite defection. That condition is not being met. When crises hit, these loyalists immediately frame the unrest as foreign-backed sedition, which lowers their internal barriers to lethal violence and causes them to close ranks.
But beneath this institutional strength, the sources acknowledge deep compounding vulnerabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. The state's foundations are corroding. The state is objectively poorer. It's weaker abroad, having lost its key proxy Assad in Syria in 2024 and suffering infrastructure damage from the war with Israel in 2025. And domestically, it faces deeper, broader opposition than ever before. Symbolically, we see attacks on regime icons, like the toppled effigies of Qasem Soleimani, which point to what analysts call the breaking of a spell.
That erosion of the state's mythic power is symbolic, but it's powerful in a theocracy.
The sources suggest that when power has to be constantly performed, shouted, and lethally enforced, it is often because the myth that sustained it is beginning to crack. The regime is currently shouting its certainty into a country that appears unconvinced and desperate. While a sudden collapse is not imminent, the combination of economic pain and institutional hollowing out means the fall of a giant is no longer unthinkable.
Given this tension between institutional strength and deep vulnerability, analysts identify three realistic scenarios for the immediate future. These are trajectories, not guarantees of collapse.
Right. The analysts dismiss the possibility of a guaranteed collapse. Instead, they offer scenarios that reflect the current stalemate. The first, and historically most common, is the slow bleed. This scenario sees the current status quo persist, high inflation continues, the exchange rate weakens in steps, and the regime relies on targeted arrests and selective repression rather than mass bloodshed to manage dissent.
And the second scenario involves direct, conscious escalation by the regime.
That is escalation and repression. This would occur if the protests expand significantly into sustained, coordinated strikes, particularly in critical sectors like transport, energy, and public services. If the state perceives an existential threat to its economic engine, the regime may calculate that overwhelming preemptive force is necessary, and that prior appointment of the hardliner Ahmad Vahidi to a senior IRGC role signals that this readiness to escalate is already in place.
And the third scenario is a prolonged, agonizing internal collapse.
The slow unraveling. This is a prolonged stalemate marked by grinding poverty and intermittent unrest, which doesn't lead to a dramatic moment of collapse, but slowly hollows out the system financially, politically, and morally. For genuine regime change to occur, this scenario demands two things that are currently scarce: coordinated elite defections and a credible, unified vision of the day after among the opposition.
Finally, we must discuss the path to accountability for the crimes documented by the UN mission, since domestic accountability is clearly lacking, as we saw with the Zahidan investigations.
Given the systematic nature of impunity, the mission's recommendations are strong and forward-looking. They urge the Human Rights Council to mandate an independent body to follow up on the mission's work after its mandate ends.
What exactly would this independent body be tasked with, and why is that so crucial?
Its role would be threefold. First, to continue investigating allegations of serious human rights violations and crimes against humanity. Second, to monitor any accountability efforts, ensuring they're transparent and meaningful. And most importantly, it would be tasked with preserving evidence,
Including that confidential list of alleged perpetrators.
Yes, that list of judges, commanders, interrogators that was handed to the OHCHR High Commissioner. This ensures that the evidence is ready for future legal proceedings that comply with international human rights standards, whenever political conditions might allow.
This emphasizes the mission's finding that judges themselves incurred individual criminal responsibility by relying on torture-tainted evidence and upholding a system of gender-based persecution.
Exactly. The mission detailed the instrumental role that the judiciary played in legitimizing the repression. The continuation of this investigative work is vital to maintain the pursuit of truth, equality, justice, and transformative reparations, reflecting the expectations expressed by victims and survivors who have endured unimaginable violence.
This has been a profound deep dive into the dual crises defining Iran in early 2026. To synthesize our findings, we are witnessing a defining conflict. On one side, you have the deep economic precarity driven by the currency collapse and high inflation, which has significantly widened the domestic coalition against the regime, reaching across all classes.
And that economic crisis is intersecting violently with the systematic, gender-based persecution that defines the state's very identity, from the judicial cementation of discrimination to the terrifying scale of the death penalty. Yet the rigidity of the repression has only spurred this innovative, symbolic resistance, those pragmatist, feminist tactics of haircutting and turban knocking we analyzed.
It's a system of deep institutional strength, facing its maximum level of vulnerability in the form of widespread public desperation. The state uses fear as its primary instrument, but as one protester was quoted saying, "I'm not scared, for 47 years I've been dead." That level of emotional and material exhaustion is where true defiance is born.
The resilience of the movement in the face of such profound violence and economic hardship is truly astounding and must be remembered.
So let's end on a final provocative thought, tying together the core economic and human crises. Iran is implementing a plan to remove 4 zeros from its banknotes to make the numbers look smaller, to make the currency appear less disastrously devalued. It's a cosmetic fix for a hemorrhage. But the underlying inflation, the fiscal deficits, and the total lack of accountability for crimes against humanity remain entrenched.
The attempt to cosmetically reset the currency doesn't address the fundamental loss of public trust or the actual economic value. It's just masking the problem, not solving it.
So which zero matters more in Iran today? Is it the 4 zeros being removed from the currency in an attempt to stabilize the economy's appearance? Or is it the human rights zero that reflects the government's systematic and institutionalized failure to provide justice, accountability, and dignity to its citizens? That ultimately is the measure of this crisis.
A question that forces a deep, honest reflection on the true cost of state power built on persecution.
Absolutely. Thank you for providing us with these crucial sources, learner, and letting us take this deep dive into such complex and important material. We'll be back next time with another stack of sources and another chance to become well-informed quickly.